I'm delighted to be here. You know, I was here 7 years ago for a ULI event that Mary invited me to, and this is the lesson that you have to be careful about what you say, because John Hobson sent me an editorial that was in your newspaper about that speech in 2011. So it's the story that whatever you do or say are going to come back to haunt you at some time. And what I want to say, though, is you ought to give all of you yourselves a big hand, because from 7 years ago to now, wow, what a difference your city has become. With the arena, with the hotel, with really the life on the street now is so different than what it was 7 years ago. And I also see it in your attitude of really optimism about the future, rather than sort of this sort of insecurity that you had 7 years ago about where we're going as a city. So I see that in all of you, that you've taken on a new attitude about what it means to be able to lead your city. And that's what intentionality is about. Because what we're talking about is intentionality, about you making a choice about the kind of city you want to have, rather than sort of drifting into the future. I have an opportunity with ULI to travel, and I've been to well over 100 cities since the 7 years ago when I was here. And what I found, that every city in the world, whether it's Hong Kong or Lafayette, Louisiana, or New York City, they're all trying to figure out where their place is in the world. And what does that mean? That means that the rules of the world are changing enormously. I can't get this to move. Help me. And there are forces at work that are fundamentally changing the rules of what made cities work and for all of our lives. I want you to think about climate change, for example, or technology, or, you know, if you come to Pittsburgh, for example, there are 200 driverless Uber cars on the street today. Are you ready for that? Because it's coming. And it's fundamentally not only that technology, but our phones and everything else, and how we buy things with Amazon, and all of that is changing the rules of what is happening. And there's a story I want to tell you that sort of sums this up. How many of you have heard of Horatio Nelson Jackson? I see one person here. And only because I told John about it. You all fail American history because he changed your life. And he was here in Sacramento. Horatio Nelson Jackson was a doctor in Vermont. And when he was in California, in San Francisco at a medical convention, he was out to dinner with a group of other doctors, and they were debating about the impact of the automobile on American society. And Horatio thought it was a game changer. It was fundamentally going to change society. And all those doctors, as smart as they were, didn't think it was going to have much impact. It was really going to be a toy for the rich. There was no infrastructure, and who's going to be able to afford that? And they bet him $50. He bet them $50 he could drive across the United States in 90 days. And they all laughed and took the bet. And the very next day, Horatio went out and bought his first car. He convinced the young mechanic, Sewall Crocker, to go with him, and they bought a dog for whatever reasons that day named Bud. And the very next day, with no support, no maps really, they're on the road driving across the United States. It was 1903. And in 1903, there were 150 miles of paved road in America, 8,000 cars, and no highway department in any state. 63 days later, Horatio, Sewall, and Bud drove down Fifth Avenue in New York City. They were the first people to drive across the United States. That was in 1903. By 1923, there were 10 million cars, hundreds of thousands of miles of paved road, and a highway department in every state. We're there now. You know, in 1903, there were 55,000 harness makers in America. And by 1923, there were 2,500. Think about what is happening now. Think about what's happening in the newspaper profession and 100 other retailing a whole host of professions where people thought they were secure that are now fundamentally getting changed. We're watching those converging forces fundamentally change the rules. And the cities that will succeed will be those that understand how to position their cities to compete. Take demographics, for example. How many of you belong to AARP? Go ahead, give it up. If any of you belong to AARP, you know you get this sort of wonderful magazine, but about every other month in the magazine, there's articles about the best places to live for the boomers. And the boomers really want to live where their kids now want to live, which is in walkable communities with really a lot of good restaurants and culture. And am I describing Sacramento? And so we're seeing that in every city in America, the empty nesters wanting to move back into cities. Even more dramatically are our kids, or our grandkids, our millennials. They are the biggest bubble in the demographic, 83 million of them, and they're fundamentally redefining society as we know it. And part of what it is that 75% of them want to live in walkable urban communities. They're 6 times less likely to own an automobile than their parents at that age. 6 times less likely. They're interested in nobility, not the statement about the kind of car I have. And so Uber and Lyft and driverless cars all have grown up because of mobility rather than people wanting to own a car. And so cities that understand that are making the kind of investments that position them to compete. And that we live in this moment of time, which I call the big lie theory of government, which is that we can have great parks and wonderful schools and safe streets and nobody has to pay anything. How many times have you heard that? And I'm not encouraging higher taxes, but I'm going to say if you don't invest in your community, you will not have the community you want to have. You got to invest in it. And you've done that. But I want to talk about Oklahoma City, one of the most conservative cities in America. For now, 3 times over the last 12 years, the citizens of Oklahoma City have voted to raise taxes on themselves. Why? Because they wanted to build a community that was competitive. And the first, it's called the MAPS program. The first vote they did, which passed by 54% of the vote, they built a new park system in Oklahoma City that is spectacular. Really, they have the Olympic trials for rowing in this little creek that they dammed up and made an Olympic-sized pool in the creek so that they could compete for the Olympics. Think about that. Think about a city reimagining themselves in an entirely different kind of way. Do I need to tell you about Chicago, a Millennium Park? Mayor Daley, when they were buying that old railroad yard, just pictured sort of an extension of Grant Park and a big big grass field, and with a parking spaces underneath. And the business leadership of the community said, if we're going to build a new park, let's do something world class rather than it'll do. And out of that came Millennium Park, which is the most visited place in Chicago now. It is one of the most remarkable parks in the country. The story I love the best is Greenville, South Carolina. The Department of Transportation in North Carolina in the 1970s built a highway. I want you to think I-5, by the way. Built a highway through Greenville because they wanted to get people through Greenville. And they built it over there, this wonderful waterfall on the Reedy River. They buried the waterfall under this highway, and they made a 4-lane road running right through the middle of the city. Took the sidewalks, took the parking spaces along the road. And a mayor got elected in the 90s, and he said, we don't want this road, and we don't want this bridge. We don't want people to drive through Greenville. We want people to stay in Greenville. And they tore the bridge down. They took out the highway. They made a 2-lane road, put parking, widened the sidewalks, put cafes along the sidewalks, put a walking bridge in. Greenville now is an incredible city. It is booming. Businesses have located there. BMW has a major operation there. It is a city that is alive because they imagine a different kind of place for themselves. Cincinnati, I want to talk particularly to the business leadership here in Sacramento about what Cincinnati did. Downtown Cincinnati was failing. And it's the home to major corporations like Procter & Gamble and Kroger's. And right up against downtown Cincinnati was a neighborhood called Over the Rhine. Spectacular historic buildings, but it was described as the worst neighborhood in America. That had about 50% of all the crime in Cincinnati. Terrible place, right up against, right across the street from Kroger's world headquarters. And the business leadership, because they did not have strong political leadership in Cincinnati, the business leadership said, we're going to take responsibility for this. And they created an organization called 3CDC. It is composed of the business leadership of the community. They raised $50 million of private money. They invested it in the downtown and in rehabbing Over the Rhine. They took this old square in the downtown that had nothing going on it with a parking garage underneath that was owned by the city that was losing money, millions of dollars a year. They instead programmed it. So you have great public spaces, and I heard Michael talking about some of your concerts. That programming is so important, and they've turned this Fountain Square, the center of Cincinnati, with 275 events a year into the place that people go. And the parking garage now makes lots of money. And they took an old park that was a drug park where the homeless and drug addicts hung out and did business, and now they refurbished it, and it's a remarkable new park. This has all happened to the 3CDC, the private organization, partnered with the city, and that private organization led the redevelopment of both downtown and Over the Rhine. So that $50 million that was initially put into that as a low-interest patient money loan program has now generated over $2 billion worth of development, which brings me to Pittsburgh. How many of you have been to Pittsburgh? So if you've been there recently, it's a pretty impressive city, but I want to give a little history to you. Between 1970 and 1990, we lost 500,000 people left the Pittsburgh region. That's why there are so many Steeler fans here. There are failures, actually. Why I say there are failures is that we couldn't give them a reason to stay in Pittsburgh. The steel mills were collapsing. There were really no jobs in Pittsburgh. Our unemployment rate hit 22%. And so we were struggling as a city about what we were going to be, that we needed to remake ourselves. Much like every city is in the world today, trying to figure out what they want to be. And we went from being the most economically depressed with a 22% unemployment rate in one of the most environmentally degraded cities in America to, as you might know, Time and Forbes and The Economist have all ranked Pittsburgh now as the most livable city in America. One of the things we did was take advantage of our rivers. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, my mother would always say two things to me: be home before the streetlights come on, and she'd say, never go near those rivers. If you go in those rivers, you're going to melt. Because one, they were very polluted, and the other is that they were filled with factories, or the waterfronts were filled with factories and railroads, and so we had no access to our waterfronts whatsoever. When I was becoming mayor in 1994, we had less than a mile of access to our waterfronts. We have three big rivers, very similar in size to your rivers, the Sacramento River, and we never used them. We turned our backs. And so I'm staying at the Embassy Suites Hotel, and it's very familiar. They turned their back to the river. There's not even a window that looks out on that side of the building on the first floor. And so we were doing that with all of our buildings because you didn't think about the rivers much. The rivers look like this. They were heavy industry, and now if you come to Pittsburgh, they look like this. We have 30 miles of waterfront park in Pittsburgh. And in fact, I can go from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C., 345 miles and never go on a road. It's a continuous park. It's a great 5-day bike ride. It goes through history and beautiful scenery and through the most industrialized place in the country. If we can figure that out, you can figure out your waterfronts. I don't want to hear the excuses. We have a highway there. And so, we have continuous riverfront trails now. Some place quiet, you wouldn't believe you're in the city. Other places active, where people are taking advantage of the river. We rent kayaks. I mean, for those of us who grew up in Pittsburgh, it's unbelievable that you would kayak in one of these rivers, right? And we enjoy the rivers in a way that we have never imagined. And this was Three River Stadium. What were architects smoking and drinking in the 60s and 70s? This is right across the river from a great city. And what's the highest and best use? A big concrete bowl and 30 acres of parking and a road along the river and hardly any park. Just like if the water was low, you could walk along the riverfront. So the Steelers lost the Super Bowl. We blew it up. And we built a new football stadium and a new baseball park, pretty much described as the best baseball park in America. We built a new convention center, the largest certified green building in America when it was built. That's that waterfront now. We took the road off. We created a park all along there. We created, and then we developed along that park. We created waters. So there's more than $3 billion worth of development on our waterfronts now. And so when PNC Bank, a large bank, builds their operation centers on the waterfronts, they put locker rooms in for their employees so that they can use the trail. Alcoa, the world headquarters of Alcoa, when they put their their headquarters on the waterfront, they put locker rooms in for their employees to encourage them to use the trail to ride a bike back and forth to work, or in the lunchtime to take a walk and then be able to come back. And so we now created a sense of place on our waterfronts. This is another one. This was a slag dump. For those of you don't know, slag is a byproduct of steel as a cinder, and for 90 years it was dumped here on our waterfront. It looks like the moon. Nothing grows on it. It's not particularly toxic, but there was a lot of it. That face is 300 feet deep. And we bought that as a city and made a decision to redevelop it. People thought we were nuts. And that's the slag being dumped there. And we redeveloped it. There's 700 homes there. The 250 acres, we took 150 acres and put it into a new park, which you see running down the valley along the water. Very polluted, sewerage, and just a lot of runoff. And we, smart young engineers we hired, cleaned that up, thought about how to recreate the original stream. We had to create the flow of the original stream. And if you go there today, that's what you see. It's a remarkable transformation that you could do in that. This was an old railroad bridge. My father worked in this steel mill for 51 years, and he sat at the end of that bridge for lunch every day. He would sit on the bridge, and this was called the hot metal bridge, not because of a band, but because it carried the hot metal from one side of the river to another in the steel making process. When the mills went down, we bought all of this. And we created this bridge, took one part of the bridge and made it into for car traffic, but the other part of the bridge we took and turned it into a bike trail. It's an incredible bike trail at a 120-year-old railroad bridge. It's a spectacular view of the city. So we put trails between. Doesn't that picture on your left look familiar with some of when I go down by Old Town? We created trails under there that people wanted to use. We built sculptures and water features that would bring people to an area that's a sculpture to celebrate the people that made steel for 100 years and got us through World War II. That bridge I showed you, the hot metal bridge, 25% of the steel made in America during World War II went across that bridge every day. And it was heavily guarded by the military during World War II. So we wanted to celebrate that legacy, as you could do in Sacramento along your waterfront. Not as a sort of an it'll-do kind of place that nobody wants to go to, but a place that celebrates who you are. We tell that story. So there's the pieces of the puzzle. You need to think strategically. It's your whole waterfront. How do you put it together? How do you create value in that? I mean, I want you to think a moment. How many of you have seen the Highline Park in New York City? So what's the dumbest idea in the world you could ever think of? Taking an old railroad right-of-way, a trestle, 30 feet in the air, has been abandoned for 50 years, and turning it into a park. Isn't that the dumbest idea in the world? Brilliant idea. A brilliant idea. One of the most visited places in New York City. And it wasn't smart architects or smart politicians. It was people, kids that went up there hanging around and said, you ought to go up there and look around. It is the best view of New York City. And Michael Bloomberg, the mayor, understood that and did that. It's dynamic leadership. You have that. In the Downtown Partnership, you have it in Mayor Steinberg. Take advantage of it. Take advantage of that leadership. Understand that you need to be together as a community, to not simply be incremental in what you do, but to be bold. And what I see after 7 years of not being here is you now have the confidence to do that. You now have the confidence to be bold. And you take advantage of it. It's about the partnerships between organizations like the Downtown Partnership, the business leadership, the chamber, and the mayor and the political leadership. It's about taking advantage of that partnership that I can hear you have. And Michael talked about this. What does GE and Fifth Third and Kraft Foods and Marriott and Google and Motorola and McDonald's, I didn't put McDonald's, what do they all have in common over the last 2 years? You all know? You need to know this. They've all moved their headquarters from suburban locations into cities. GE moved their thousands of jobs from a suburban campus in Connecticut, in a cushy part of Connecticut, into downtown Boston. Marriott has moved from a suburban office park in Washington, D.C. into downtown Bethesda. Motorola is moving into, as is McDonald's, into downtown Chicago from affluent suburbs of Chicago. Why are they doing that? They're doing it because they're chasing talent. They're chasing the people that they want to get to work for them, and those people want to live in urban, vibrant urban areas. And you're building that. And so this is about the architects in the room. If you're going to build something, I went for a long run walk yesterday, and I go down some of your streets, and you have these spectacular, like craftsman houses, 1930s, and then right in the middle of the block is like a 1980 apartment building. What happened? It's your watch now. It's your watch now. You need to pay attention to what you build. When I fly into Sacramento and come in and there's a sign that says, "Welcome to Sacramento." You'll say, we're a green city, we're a world-class city, we're a friendly city. You would never think to say we're a mediocre city, would you? But that's what you say if you don't design things really spectacularly. You have great bones in the city. You need to respect them and build on them. This is, by the way, a park this was in Pittsburgh, right at the entrance of the University of Pittsburgh, our museum district. This is what we thought was the best use of a piece of property for 50 years. And then I got together with the chancellor and I said, this is really a terrible entrance to your campus. And so we turned it into a park, and I got 600 letters of hate about the people that park there every day, and where are we going to park? And I said, you'll get over it. But this is a better use, right? thousands of kids on a nice summer day are hanging out there. There's a carousel. There's a great little restaurant. Think about how you liven those areas. And so I want to say to you, I can talk about this. And I can give you great pictures. And you can picture some of the things you've done. You just have gotten started. You just have gotten started. You need to understand that if you're going to do this, you need to figure out how you're going to pay for a great city. And the mayor is going to come to you with some ideas about that, an equity fund, that how the city and private sector can partner together to fundamentally transform Sacramento. That needs to happen. When we took over Pittsburgh, we said we needed 4 things. We needed money, we needed land control, we had thousands of acres of abandoned steel mills that were bankrupt and nobody was going to touch them. We needed a sophisticated deal making because I love developers, but I don't want them to pick my pocket. And the fourth is that we needed to know where we wanted to go. We needed to have a vision of the kind of city we wanted. And that's what I want to challenge you to think about. I don't want you to think about a sort of an it'll-do kind of vision. I want you to imagine a city that is beyond what you've ever thought about. You have the confidence now to do that. It's a question of, my view is it is fundamentally never about the money or the land or anything else. It is always about whether you have the community and political will to reach for the future. And that reaching for the future means that you need to kick the door down. Because there will be powerful forces that will say, well, we can't do this. Every time I went out into the community, which was a lot, and said, this is what we want to do, there were 100 people, at least, the mayor knows this, 100 people at least giving me a reason why it can't happen. It's the wrong color, it's the wrong place, it's too big, it's too small, and of course, we never have enough money to do that. Don't let them define the agenda. Kick that door down. Reach for the future. Good luck.